Hello, and welcome to CivilNet. Today our guest is Karnig Kerkonian. He's an international lawyer, professor, and a member of the Committee for the Defense of the Fundamental Rights of the People of Artsakh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Well, I'm excited to have you because I've seen you online for years. You're involved in so many things and have so much experience, so we've got a lot to talk about. Just yesterday, we had news come out that Armenia and Azerbaijan have agreed to the points of a peace deal, and one of those appears to be the withdrawal of their mutual claims at international courts. So, being an international lawyer, I think you have some things to say about it. What's the wisdom of this move?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's wisdom in this move, unfortunately. In fact, I'd like to probably start by really putting it in context. And I think the context is really important here, and maybe a little bit of a history lesson to show kind of an analogous moment in history, perhaps the colossal lesson of the post-World War II era. Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister of the UK, had traveled to Munich in 1938, looked into the eyes of an aggressive leader at that time of Germany named Adolf Hitler, and said that I looked into his eyes and he promised me peace. Now in 1938-39, this was the period after which Hitler had already conquered Sudetenland, and Neville Chamberlain's goal was to bring peace to Europe. He came back with a peace treaty, the Munich Accord, ran it through the streets of London saying that we have peace, we have peace, we have peace. History shows what the next steps of Hitler were. That treaty wasn't honored. In fact, what came was not war to Europe, but genocide. And I think it's really important to understand that historical context. In my view, Baku's capture and taking of Artsakh is the Sudetenland of this current regime in Baku. This is the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. We're actually in the middle of a very significant process. The colossal lesson of post-World War II geopolitics is that appeasement doesn't work. And that form of appeasement has taken, the appeasement has taken the form of territorial conquests, demands on Armenia with respect to negotiating formats, changes in the constitution, villages in Tavush, an army inside the borders of the Republic of Armenia, demilitarization, etc. So we have to look at the peace treaty in the proper context, and unfortunately, history has taught us that this process of appeasement only leads to further demands and further concessions. In fact, this is what brought Churchill to power in London, who said, after Neville Chamberlain, who said that appeasement's like feeding the crocodile, hoping that it would eat you last. And that's the process that we have right now. I mean, I've been to Sunik a number of times with the former human rights defender of Armenia, Arman Tatoyan. I have seen what is happening in Shurnukh, in Vorodan, in Nerkinhand. It is a crisis. It's a very serious crisis. The taking of Artsakh has brought Azerbaijani forces to within meters of Armenian schools, has brought Azerbaijani forces to the slopes of mountains overlooking villages like Nerkinhand. You can go to the Sunik airport even today. You can stand there, and all you see when you look at the airport runway is Azerbaijani flags across in the slopes of those mountains. I think this is what appeasement does, unfortunately. And I think that we're at a very critical moment right now when we see what's happening with the discussions on a peace treaty vis-a-vis the cases. The withdrawal of the cases is yet another demand. It's another ask for further concessions and further appeasement. The withdrawal of the cases actually turns the entire concept of a just and dignified peace on its head. In international practice, the idea of a just and dignified peace is exactly that it should sit on the pillars of justice. Well, you're not going to get a more pronounced decision of what justice looks like in this situation other than the International Court of Justice cases. Those cases and those decisions show and demonstrate what is a just result. And they include themes like the right of return of the Artsakh people. They include themes like underlining the actual mental intent, the mental state of the regime in Baku, founding its actions on racial hatred against the Armenians. I mean, these are fundamental concerns that we need to be addressing in a peace treaty. not setting them aside. And I think that this sets an extremely dangerous precedent, demonstrating that a peace treaty that is on terms that do not incorporate the decisions of the cases, the underlying rationale of the cases, puts us at risk of not having a durable peace. In fact, I think we're going just the opposite. I think that this is just another layer of concessions which Azerbaijan will use as a stronghold from which to make further demands. And we will see that in the next several days, just like we saw after the handover of villages in Tavush, within 24 hours, there were already renewed demands for a corridor, not peace. There were renewed demands for sovereign territory within Armenia. And I think that after these announcements, we're going to see those demands again, because there is no reason for Azerbaijan to stop. There is no reason. We know the mental state. The cases were a formidable obstacle in the international world in terms of diplomatic efforts, where it was clear that Azerbaijan was violating norms of international law, was violating treaties, was violating various agreements that it had signed. And maybe it's a newsflash for people, but perpetrators of war crimes, perpetrators that move on genocidal intent and hatred and racial hatred, they don't stop at the signature on a piece of paper. They don't. And if we don't learn that from our own experience, we should definitely learn that from the colossal lesson of the post-World War II era. Perpetrators don't stop at treaties. Maybe that's a newsflash.
Well, it feels like, in a lot of ways, though, we're between a rock and a hard place, because, and maybe this is a conspiracy, but I'm going to keep harping on this. Just a couple of days ago, we had news in the official news outlet of the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry, Caliber, saying that we've uncovered a plot by Armenia, that they're going to be invading in April, and we must put a stop to this. And that's how they did the 2020 war as well. They said Armenia attacked us, when they've since admitted that, nope, that was us. We're the one who invaded. So was that even perhaps a warning to Armenia, or a deadline? If you don't do something by then, we're invading. And they very well know Armenia has no security guarantees. The CSTO isn't worth the paper it's written on. Europe, the European monitors, they said, we'll run away if anyone attacks, because we are a civilian, even though Azerbaijan says there's some sort of they're attacking everyone. And it seems like everyone is just rolling over. So, I mean, what does this look like? What does standing up to, which we need to do, I agree, don't roll over, but at the same time, if they invaded tomorrow, what would happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that, there's this fatalistic approach that says, we don't have any options, we never have any options. But let's not forget that we're sitting here, almost 7 years after 2018, the revolution in 2018. We're sitting here half a decade after the war. This is a process. So where we've brought ourselves is the result of continuous and systemic concession. So let's not look at this moment and say, well, we have no options because, well, this is the situation that we're in. We contributed to this process by our concessions and appeasement. And this is a really important point to remember, because that is the lesson that appeasement teaches. You put yourself in a more difficult situation by continually making these types of concessions. And here, some of the key elements. We've had situations where our diplomatic efforts we've made concessions in procedural points, which then have very important substantive ramifications that come later, and we say, well, we never knew, this is a very difficult situation for us. I don't know how we got here. We know exactly how we got here. For example, the idea of not pushing for a third-party guarantor or facilitator or mediator in the peace talks. This is a very important point. If we had a third-party facilitator, we could use the International Court of Justice decisions and other international norms and say, look, we want to have a peace treaty that is consistent with international law. Those international court decisions mean that. It's a pronouncement of what international law is on this issue. That procedural failure allows us to be further bullied in the negotiations on substantive points. The handover of villages in Tavush leads to more strategic demands. The loss of Artsakh did not bring peace. I mean, this was the treasure, right, of the South Caucasus, was who was going to control Nagorno-Karabakh. Clearly, that didn't bring peace either. So there's a problem with the systemic process and our understanding. And I think that at its core, I think is a diplomatic failure. And I'll tell you where I think it's a diplomatic failure. The failure to translate wins in the international legal scape. People say, well, international law, nobody listens to international law. The first line of utilization of the decisions of the International Court of Justice or other international bodies is the foreign ministry. It is diplomacy. We have to translate those decisions into actual gains on the ground. Unfortunately, that has not been happening, and has not been happening repeatedly. So yes, we find ourselves in a dire situation, but I can assure you, in the next 2 or 3 months, we will find ourselves in a more dire situation, and those lines are going to get more and more expensive to draw. So we need to find, and we don't have the specific facts, and I agree with you that Azerbaijan uses pressure and uses, the threat and use of force, which in and of itself obviously is against the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, to use force to, and actually makes the treaty void and nullifies the treaty if it's done by force. But you got to make those arguments, right? I mean, this is the one thing about rights that people just don't understand, but it happens in the municipal context and in international law. Rights are not self-effectuating. Because there is a right doesn't mean you automatically get to benefit from it. You have to advocate for it. You have to advocate for it in the right forums. Unfortunately, we don't see that happening. And it's difficult to say where that line should have been drawn, but the lessons of appeasement show us that that line needs to be drawn early and hard. Unfortunately, that is not what's happened. It's the same mistake that Neville Chamberlain made. What I'm afraid of, knowing what those international cases show in terms of, and the evidence and the proof, not only of the war crimes, but the brutality that's involved, and the use of these sham trials to essentially change the narrative, right? I think that it shows that there's an underlying intent for a lot more than just war in this region. And if we can see the way they've treated Armenian POWs, Armenian captives, the cruelty and brutality with which they treat political prisoners and POWs today, and the rhetoric coming from Azerbaijan, we don't have to look very far. Erdogan's statements in Baku in the post-war period, speaking of Nuri Pasha and glorifying him, that should speak to us. We should understand that was not 2024, that was 2020. We have to place these facts into the larger narrative, these incidents in the larger narrative, as to what the ultimate plan is. If we don't see that, we're going to get caught sitting in cafes just like they were in Paris in 1938, with an army rushing across the South Caucasus with this intent. And I think that we can't say in retrospect, we're going to look at this moment historically, in 300-400 years, when historians look back at this moment, they're going to be able to draw the connections between what we saw in 1915, Erdogan's statements in Baku in 2020, Sumgait, Baku, Kirovabad, and also what happened in Artsakh in 2023. They're going to be able to draw these connections as part of a larger plan. We know we see the evidence of genocidal intent. In fact, let's just look back 1 week. We see what Erdogan is doing in Syria. These are important points to put together. We can't be putting out fires and saying, well, we don't have any choice, we don't have any choice. We have a choice. Our main choice is to understand the narrative and communicate this narrative to third-party actors. Unfortunately, we are not telling that story. In fact, we're letting Azerbaijan tell a completely different story, right? Right now, they're telling the story of terrorists and separatists, and that's the story they're telling. That's the story they're pushing. We're going to see further demands, not only for a corridor, we're going to see further demands for demilitarization.
Yes,
this is exactly what's happening. And we're not, and these are fully expected. If you just take a step back and look at what we have, unfortunately, our diplomacy has to tell that story of systemic oppression, a systemic attempt to rid the region of Armenians, a systemic attempt to change the narrative, to make Armenia the aggressor. But it can't be a story based on an incident. It's a story where the incident fits within a plan, an entire agenda. And the foundation of that agenda are those cases, establishing the racial hatred that exists. And unfortunately, the withdrawal of those cases turns the entire process on its head, because what it does is it allows Azerbaijan to steer away from that story and push its own narrative. And unfortunately, withdrawing those cases is kind of removes one of those fundamental points, which is really the intent and the mental state of the Baku regime today in the South Caucasus.
And as Ruben Vardanyan has been saying from jail in Baku, this is targeted at all Armenians. I mean, they are attempting to criminalize all of us. And this is not just aimed at those 23. No one is, I mean, they've said no one is safe, and it's true, whether you're in Armenia or even outside of Armenia. Well, we've seen what they do to their own dissenters. So this is extremely worrisome. But I guess from the outside, what we see is it just looks like, well, at every turn, Azerbaijan said no, and we have no recourse. Like when it came to, okay, they said no to the EU because the EU was biased, and they said America was biased, and Armenia didn't want to have just Russia doing it. And so it seemed like no platforms were working, and then they just went ahead with, we're going to fly blind and just do it ourselves, and which is extremely dangerous, like you've said. What is, is this just the government having a lack of creativity or vision, or, they just see they just still are hoping for the best, what do you think their mindset is here?
Well, I think that, what we have to look at is a track record. I mean, in the end, governments are judged by their actions. Governments are judged by their decisions. I think that there's a clear failure to properly translate principles of international law and international legal decisions, which are very rare that you get in the middle of a process, right? I mean, we're getting actual decisions that speak on this issue. So I think number one, there's a failure in I would call diplomatic translation, right? To be able to translate these cases into actual diplomatic victories. I think that's one. I think there's also a geopolitical problem, and that is this idea of jumping from the lap of one superpower to another superpower, and back and forth. And I think that type of a fickle approach to a very serious situation, it doesn't take us very far. In fact, most foreign governments don't take us very seriously in that respect. Not understanding the larger, I guess let me speak to this first. Not understanding the value of actually having to balance powers and not take pot shots at superpowers in the region just for the sake of showing off to other superpowers that you're on their side. Armenia doesn't really have a choice to be on sides. What Armenia has to do is have a very balanced diplomacy that's focused on its national security, and that understands in a very sophisticated way not only the power struggles between those countries, right? But also understands the larger ideological shifts that are happening in the world today. Armenia has been on, kind of pushing on, I would argue, on the last car, the caboose of the neoliberal train. You can look around the world today and you can see Zelensky's reception that he received in the Oval Office, and the impact of, let's say, the Trump administration's shift throughout Europe. Orban is celebrating this new, voice, right, of
reshaping the international order in a lot of ways.
And reshaping the discourse. And I think we have, in order for us to participate in that discourse, we have to speak in that discourse. The idea of national identity, the idea of even religious fervor is taking on new meaning in the region. We got to be, we're not a country of the strategic importance to be able to shift narratives, global narratives. We can shift our own narrative, but global narratives we have to be responsive to. We have to understand which direction the world is going and speak in the proper language. It cannot be, and here's a word that the Trump administration uses all the time, it can't be common sense for a country like Armenia to rely on, let's say, Washington for its security guarantees. I mean, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean that our security guarantees have to come only from Moscow or largely from, there is an importance of diversification, but we have to understand that, if I'm not mistaken, I think Edward Jerejian was sitting here in the same place that I'm sitting, a few months ago, making this very point. I don't know who's listening or who's not listening when an Armenian when an individual with Armenian roots is sitting here with the experience that Ambassador Jerejian has in the region. Let's not forget, ambassador to Syria, ambassador to Israel, saying that Armenia cannot put all of its eggs in the United States basket. We need to be listening. When we have thinkers like Jeffrey Sachs and Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, and leading thinkers in Moscow like Karaganov and Lukyanov saying the same thing, that Armenia's security arrangement cannot ignore Russia. This is what the American thinkers, realpolitik thinkers, and and Russian intellectuals are saying this is very rare that you have that type of agreement. Well, if we're having that type of agreement in intellectual circles on leaders of foreign policy, and speaking specifically about Armenia, this is in their text, you can read them online, speaking specifically to Armenia in the post-war period. That's a very unique window, right? These points are very important to take. That doesn't mean that Armenia should be within this lap or that lap. It underlines the point that Armenia needs to be focused on its individual security in a way that is a little bit more sophisticated than hopping from lap to lap, because that doesn't get us anywhere.
Hearing Ambassador Georgian say that was really like a wake-up call. Like, this is an American saying that we're so used to this, the US versus Russia and just, do everything. No, this is an American diplomat telling Armenia, hey, that was really something. So
let's be honest. Even that is changing as we speak here today.
Yeah, no more U.S. versus Russia. Now it's the U.S. and Russia, and Europe is the one on the outs, and Armenia has been trying to get closer to Europe. And well, wait, if you're trying to get closer to U.S. and Europe at the same time, but they're actually moving away from each other, it's like doing a split between two trucks, and what's going on.
And I think it's really important for us to realize that we need to be fighting our security battles, not fighting battles as proxies for other superpowers. We have to understand, and I think that there are countries that have learned how to do this, right? Israel is one, right? That plays just as sophisticated with the United States as it does with Russia, as it does with a number of other countries in Europe, even in South America, and other countries in the Middle East. We've seen dramatic shifts. We're in a place where we can actually balance a lot of competing powers. That's a strength if you're able to handle that diplomatic sophistication. But going to Washington starry-eyed, thinking that because you're now opposing Russian influence in the region that you're going to be getting a basket of gifts is really not how it's going to go. Especially when we have the benefit of like Jerejan, an American diplomat with Armenian heritage and origins, coming here and actually speaking this. Jeffrey Sachs, if I'm not mistaken, was here as well. If we're listening to the actual thinkers coming out of on the foreign policy points, and implementing them, I think that we would be in a very different reality right now, and we would know where we would have to draw those red lines so that the cost of that red line doesn't get more expensive. As time goes on, we are creating a situation, and I can go back historically to one specific instance which kind of resonated with me as an international lawyer. When Brussels had encouraged Armenia and the Prime Minister to go to the floor of the National Assembly and say, let's lower the bar on Artsakh. Now, why this resonated with me is that lowering the bar on Artsakh meant lowering them from a people with the right to self-determination to a minority. And when you do that, right, when you lower the bar from a people to a minority, there's a basket of rights that you lose. One of those is the right to self-determination, which is exactly what Azerbaijan is trying to do right now, speaking of terrorism and separatism and things of that nature, trying to shift that narrative. That drop meant that we were now having a different discussion. We were having a discussion about minority rights. Well, let me say something absolutely clear about that. When you have the idea of which is the idea of this kind of internal self-determination, which you have, let's say, in Quebec, as opposed to what you have in Kosovo, right? This is a really important dichotomy, two very important pillars. Now, trying to impose the Quebec model on Artsakh should have made our heads spin. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's been to Canada realizes that the Canadian military was not situated outside Montreal with its, with tanks and with military preparation to go and destroy the Quebecois. That's exactly the factual scenario that we had here. Yet at the same time, what we were doing is trying to impose, Brussels-inspired minority narrative on the Artsakh people. Of course they voted with their feet on that point. What rational mother would want their children to be subjected to the brutality and race-based hatred that Azerbaijan has demonstrated and that the international court has underlined? We have to speak our own narratives, and when we fail to speak our own narratives, and this is where the third diplomatic mistake is when we fail to speak our narratives, other narratives are imposed on us. It is happening right now. The issue with the sham trials is much beyond the issue of a fair trial or human rights. That's the surface issue. That's just the beginning. The real issue is the fact that they're writing the story of Artsakh self-determination and the indigenous presence of the Artsakh Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh out of the history. And this is very important. This is the underlying point. And we are going to see that same history, that new narrative being repeated in Sunik. Because what do you think the Western Azerbaijan theme is? That didn't come out just yesterday. That has been a narrative that they have been propagating for the last 5, 6, 7 years. The preparations existed even before the war. That is the narrative that's going to be continuing. Again, it's part of a process. If we don't understand the process, we're putting out fires, but missing the entire forest for the trees.
Well, I want to wrap up on one thing. We've been mentioning the people of Artsakh, and they are at the center of this and should be on our minds more. Unfortunately, the government has been mostly silent about them. One of the big rights that they still have or should have internationally is the right of return. But Azerbaijan has made it very clear that that is not going to happen, or under conditions that make it literally impossible for anyone to actually go back. So what can be pursued when it comes to that?
I think that's a really important question because it also speaks to the security situation in Armenia proper. Our proper handling of the Artsakh people's right of return speaks directly to the security situation on the border in Sunik and in the villages that I mentioned earlier. Because if we do not make the proper arguments in the right way, we are actually fighting the battles literally in sovereign Armenian territory and not where we should be fighting them in Artsakh and the right of the people to return to Artsakh. And what does that mean? What can be done? I think it's first important to understand that what the pillars of what that right of self-determination is. And there's 3 main pillars: that the right of return should be exercised collectively, that it needs to be exercised with concern and understanding of international security guarantees, because given the discourse of race hate that underlies the narrative coming out of Baku, it is clear that it is headed towards genocidal intent. The international cases that we have, for example, like the CERD case, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is where we have a lot of these decisions on underlining the right of return of the Artsakh people. It's there, it says it, which is another reason why Azerbaijan doesn't want that. Want those cases, because it won't win in the court. So let's just remove it, right? Let's put pressure. But the third point is also that the people have to return with their fundamental rights, human rights, intact. And what a fundamental human right is not the right to pick your gender or to have entitlements with the government. Those are not fundamental. A fundamental human right is your right to life, and it includes your right to self-determination. That is what a human being is. In other words, it's a definition of what a human is. We would never ask or expect a human to go somewhere, like go back to Artsakh, without their fundamental human rights intact. In other words, go back to Artsakh not as a human being. We would never expect that. That's an absurd result. So those are the fundamental pillars. And what we've seen is not only do we have the processes going on, obviously in the International Court of Justice, where these rights are underlined, but based on that, we have European Parliament resolutions that speak to the issue of the right to return of the Artsakh people as an indigenous people. We also have the process that's taking place right now in the Swiss Parliament, where the lower house has already worked on establishing a platform for discussions on the right of return, and that vote is coming out for the upper house is coming in on March 18th in just a few days. So Switzerland has taken a real role in this, and other countries can also take a role in this, because it is clear that it is consistent with international law. And what is very troubling with respect to this, to the peace process that we've been seeing, is, as you mentioned, the complete elimination of the discussion of Nagorno-Karabakh from the actual substance of that treaty. And it's very of that peace treaty. But what's really interesting is that we have a government here in Yerevan that has specifically said that it doesn't speak to the rights of the Nagorno-Karabakh people. That's a statement that it's made. How then can it can undertake a treaty which has a very substantive impact on the rights of the very people a democratic government said that it does not represent? I mean, this is a very serious question in terms of our of democratic values, right? If we take the government's narrative that, well, I represent the people within the borders of Armenia and I don't represent the Nagorno-Karabakh people, well then how are your discussions, the impact of your discussion, how do you rationalize that? And I think that that's the fear that we get, and especially as we start speaking about, from a legitimacy standpoint, we start speaking about constitutional changes, which is the next area where you're going to see a lot more pressure, because it's the next step, right? Azerbaijan has made that pretty clear. Think about how absurd that is, Paul, where we're talking about a democratic country whose constitution should be reflecting the will of the people, where the changes to that constitution are being imposed by a regime outside, a non-democratic regime outside the borders of Armenia. That doesn't make any sense for any democratic country. We have to be very careful, especially when it comes to the constitutional argument. This is impacting the de facto sovereignty of the republic itself. This is what a democratic republic is. Our ability to choose what our constitution says. It's our contract with our government. That is what a constitution is. It is not Baku's contract with our government. And I think that's an important point to underline, and maybe we can close with that, because this really threatens the very underpinning of what Armenia's struggle has been over the last 30 years in terms of establishing a sovereign, independent state requires the people's voice to matter more than the president of Azerbaijan's voice or the regime in Baku's voice. And I find that is going to be the next historic challenge that we're going to be facing as Armenians.
Well, Mr. Kerkonian, that was a fascinating and sobering discussion. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we will see how this comes to pass.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining CivilNet.